Welcome to Watch Sophie. Today we'll be counting down the ways in which the Salem witch trials, or should I say errors, changed American government and religion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this is the worst title for a final project ever, but the wordplay was there and I couldn't pass it up. We'll start by briefly covering the precedents in place before the Salem witch trials occurred. Then we'll look at what happened during these trials as well as the immediate aftermath, which will lead me to my conclusion. The Salem witch trials were absolutely necessary to initiate change involving religion and American government. I'm also not going to keep up this voice for the whole presentation. I did it once for the gag and now it's done, I promise. So, prior to the Salem witch trials, there was the European witch craze, which is exactly what it sounds like. It was insane. It was a phenomenon lasting roughly 300 years, during which more than 250,000 innocents were executed for supposed witchcraft, as you probably guessed by the name. The overwhelming majority of these witches were, of course, women, with many being accused of causing tragedies or natural disasters, such as crop failure or disease. I suppose at the time they probably weren't called natural disasters, they were probably called spiritual disasters or something. But anyway, punishments for these supposed crimes varied from flogging to fines, though the less fortunate of the accused were often hanged, beheaded, or burned at the stake. Please, I wish I could get this effect to work. It's such a cool thing. Look, it's a little pentagram. I worked so hard on that and I can never get it to work correctly. Anyway. I bring up the European witch craze to lead into this because at the tail end of this craze in Europe, a small town in Massachusetts decided to show up late to the bonfire. I'm sorry, that was unnecessary. Beginning in February 1692, more than 200 people were accused of some form of witchcraft. And as with the European witch craze, most of the accused and executed were women, though 5 men were also hanged in the end. Fun fact, in Salem, nobody was actually burned at the stake, which I think is interesting because that's usually how it's portrayed in media. Regardless, one man was actually even pressed to death with stones for refusing to admit guilt. Rest in peace, Giles Corey. He was like 80 years old. It sucks. Anyway, hundreds of others were imprisoned for months in inhumane conditions, with at least one prisoner dying while still awaiting trial. At the time of these trials, witchcraft was obviously still an offense punishable by death, a law enacted as part of the Witchcraft Act of 1604, which was supported by one single verse in one single book of the Bible, Exodus, stating, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." So, I mean, they covered their bases with that one. Much of the trial's testimony was also very weakly supported. Accusers cited statements from ghosts or even their own dreams, rendering pretty much all the evidence unfalsifiable. And no one was immune from this. Husbands accused wives, daughters accused mothers, siblings turned on each other. And the youngest of those accused was a 5-year-old girl who later went insane. Gee, I wonder why. One way in which our legal system has changed since the Salem witch trials is that many things considered legally and morally reprehensible at the time are not only tolerated but fully accepted. One reason for this difference could be that at the time a lot of these things were considered horrible offenses, in part because they went against some part of the Bible or another religious doctrine. And obviously nowadays we don't have that problem because we don't have any religion in our law system. But that's a discussion for a little bit later in the presentation. Accusations in Europe during its witch craze differed a little from those in Salem. As you can see, the accusations against the supposed witches in Europe are pretty severe. And in Salem, sure, they were accusing them of engaging in devil worship, but nobody was accusing anyone of satanic orgies, at least not outright. For one thing, the accusations against supposed witches in Europe seemed to be very excessively sexual in nature compared to the accusations leveled against witches in Salem. But then again, Europe's witch craze lasted a few centuries, while Salem's trials barely lasted a year, so maybe those pervs over in Spain and England just had a couple hundred more years to think up some weird crimes. Satanic orgies, incest, sodomy. Anyway, moving on. Much of what these witches were accused of would barely turn a head in modern America. You couldn't really take someone to court over sleeping around or gossip. It would be laughable at the very least. Additionally, many accusations during the Salem witch trials were very vague in nature. I'm going to turn off the laser pointer because that's annoying me. They're very vague in nature. You accuse someone of general practice of witchcraft or seeking to destroy the Puritans. Not only does it sound very conspiracy theory-esque, But it's a pretty broad claim, and it certainly wouldn't be considered arguable in a court of law now. At least I hope not. Also, every claim made was completely baseless. There was no way to prove any of it. For instance, you couldn't prove that an accused witch in Salem was causing some teenage girls to have these behavioral fits or suffer hallucinations. Couldn't prove there was a conspiracy among hundreds of women in the area to destroy the Puritan movement. And because any actual evidence was lacking, the accusers turned to their friends on the other side. And if Disney was not so stingy about their copyright, this is where I would start playing Princess and the Frog music. But can't always get what we want now, can we? So witnesses cited testimony from spirits, there's some ghosts there for you, and biblical passages as evidence against suspected witches and to support their execution or imprisonment. And while this was accepted without question at the time, shortly thereafter, those who led these accusations felt the weight of the Holy Spirit upon them. Or maybe it was just a guilty conscience. Anyway, scholars became skeptical, but only after the trials had already ended and many had already been executed or imprisoned or just generally cast out of society. So very convenient timing on their part. And there was now more acknowledgement of just how limited the actual proof of the witchcraft was. One scholar, Sir Robert Filmer, that's my representation of him, he went so far as to say that even if there were witches, they could only be tried as accomplices to the devil himself. And as the devil could not stand trial, neither could any suspected witches. Additionally, some well-known religious figures also began to debate the existence of witches, and even though only a few were arguing against the existence of witchcraft, it was a fair few more than had been arguing against it before. One Baptist preacher by the name of William Milbourne, that is my artistic representation of William Milbourne, it's not him. Photography was lacking back then, so I couldn't find an actual photo. So this will have to do. William Milbourne urged justices to discount spectral evidence altogether, arguing that those imprisoned were accused of completely imaginary crimes. These were just the first of many arguments that eventually led to overall reconsideration of religion and spirituality in government in general. Hope you enjoyed those representations. I really did try to do them justice. So, what? What does all this mean? The aftermath of these trials may have gotten the ball rolling to eventually remove much of Christianity's influence from government, but did it really need to happen this way? Would these same changes have taken place without the loss of life and the upheaval that resulted from these trials? The short answer is yes. Well, yes, but actually no. There are certain events throughout history that are looked back on negatively, whether that's with shame or with sadness. For instance, the Black Death, for obvious reasons. The Columbian Exchange, a trade which included slaves as well as disease. Countless wars, and these trials are no exception to this rule. But out of these tragic events came some positive consequences. For instance, the Black Death created a labor shortage that eventually inspired the Industrial Revolution. Not to mention, brought an end to serfdom. Pretty cool outcome as well. The Columbian Exchange also included new crops and livestock being swapped between Europe and the Americas. And even war brought about some good change. As a result of World War I, more women entered the workforce and eventually gained the right to vote. If I could get this effect to trigger, that would be awesome. There you go. So the same principle can be applied to the Salem witch trials. How, you might ask? Well, I'm here to tell you how. It is true that the Salem witch trials are not the only historical event responsible for changes to law in what would eventually become America. There were certainly very significant changes that took place long after these trials occurred and are still happening today. And it wasn't even until the 19th century that the topic of separation of church and state was articulated and argued by Thomas Jefferson. However, it is my firm belief that without the extreme injustices that took place in Salem Village, it would have taken an event just as tragic, if not worse, to force people to reconsider whether basing law upon religious beliefs was such a good idea. The general consensus is that it was mainly guilt and shame that motivated the justices involved in these trials to pardon everyone that was tried. Granted, it was after all the trials took place, so too little too late. But I believe that without an extreme event such as this one, Many would have seen no reason to make any changes to the legal system because it was not impacting them negatively at all, at least not at the time. Even now, cases concerning the separation of religion and government are still being heard, and it's been over 300 years since the Salem witch trials took place. So if it's taken us this long to figure things out, I can only imagine how long it would have taken without a wake-up call like the one these trials provided. I thank you for your patience during this presentation. I know it's a little bit off. I tried to make it entertaining for you. I'm sure you're very tired of watching these. But to conclude, it is my firm belief that as far as how the Salem witch trials impacted the Puritan movement and kind of affected or changed our course, as far as it steered us away from having a huge religious influence in our government, I do think that the trials were unfortunately a necessary evil. I think that, sure, these changes could have taken place much later. It would have taken a lot longer to kind of get that ball rolling without this stain on our history. So these are my sources. I don't know if it's necessary to put them in the slideshow, but I'm leaving them here for you anyway. And God bless you, and thank you for a fun semester.